Welcome everybody to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Course Pro. This is the spring and summer course, and this is our 9th office hour out of a total of 10 office hours. We're about to step into our 9th week, and we're getting into assignments 18 and 19. So we'll probably start there because our questions are pretty light today. A couple of announcements to start off with. First and foremost, August 22nd is the final due date for this course, and all assignments are due on August 22nd. So there is no extension, there is no late assignments on August 22nd to make sure everyone gets their certificates, to make sure that the university can close out the course. Everything has to be in on August 22nd. So if you need further help with your assignments, definitely reach out now, because you've got T minus 21 days, 3 weeks into the end of the end of the course. Second thing I wanted to talk about today was Jamie Wallace and I. Jamie's been a award-winning ornamental landscape designer and a phenomenal ecological designer for the last close to 30 years. And we have been brewing up this idea of doing one-off workshops about everything under the sun when it comes to ecological landscape businesses. So when it comes to reputation building, when it comes to contracts, when it comes to estimating, all the things that you can then take the next step from this course. We've been asked by students for a couple of years to start to think about this. And so there is a launch list in the notes, and I'll make sure to put it into the show notes. But if you're interested in anything like that, please let us know. That's giving us a good sense of what those potential courses might look like. And I'm just going to do a quick share of that. So some of these topics: how do you start a business? How do you figure out what kind of business you're eligible to have? And this whole idea of eligibility is an important one when it comes to design. Inevitably, when you run a permaculture design course, there's going to be a few folks that want to create a food forestry company. It's just their life's calling. It's the most important thing they've ever done. And they say, great, I want to do it. And my conversation to them always is, have you planted a tree before? Have you created a business before? What are the skills that you're bringing into it? And sometimes those skills are lacking, but they have all the enthusiasm. So they're eligible to explore a food forestry design business, but they're not necessarily eligible to execute. So it's one of these things to be conscientious of what are you eligible for after PDC? And we talked a little bit about this when we began creating that compost and fire list, where on one side, on the fire list, these are things that fire you up, get you excited around the PDC. And on the other side are compost, things that are going to go back into the compost to be composted and come back as fertile soil. So really do take a look at the totality of the PDC, the major and the minor concepts, the major and the minor skills and process, and be very clear on what you're attracted to. A couple of other questions: how do you get clients, intake clients, evaluate if clients are a good fit? This is probably something that has been the most valuable for me over the years. Are the clients I'm seeking and are seeking me, are they a good fit for me and what I do? And so we're looking at doing a workshop on that. Know what to charge and when to raise prices, develop contracts with clients, estimated design, go about designing a project for a client, transitioning from the design process to the installation process. So some folks will get into this work and they'll be designers purely and solely. Some folks will be design build. Some folks really just want to put things on the ground. And it's completely up to you. If you haven't had a chance to, I'd highly recommend reading Derek Sivers' Anything You Want. Derek Sivers created a business called CD Baby back in the 90s. It was the first online music store where you could physically buy compact disc CDs. And his approach and his conversation is important to all of us. The idea that our business is our sense of utopia in the world, not just for everybody else, for ourselves as well. So it can be anything you want. So what is that going to look like? How are you going to create that? And you don't have to take a look at anybody else's business and say, well, my business has to look like that. It can be very specialized. I know folks that are just doing wicking beds. That's the only thing they do. They love building wicking beds. They love setting them up. It's a really enjoyable business for them. How do you develop an installation estimate? And then how do you revise it? Because most contractors and suppliers right now are only holding their price for 7 days because of price increases, which it's a heck of a time to be getting into this business because there's a lot more moving parts than there were when I started a decade ago. If I receive a deposit, how much should I ask for? So this goes into when you're starting off work and you're taking on the financials of a project, how much of that gets shared by the client as it's installed? How do you source materials, prep a site for installation? Good colleague and friend of mine, Luke Rosewood, we talk about this where sometimes it's like going to war, because when you're working with something like Blue Kentucky Lawn, if you don't remove it in its entirety, it's going to come back for years to come. How do you actually install a design? How do you submit a final invoice? How do you deal with delinquent payments? Transition from installation to maintenance? What do I want to do? Document my work? How do I build reputation and digital assets to assess clients while I sleep? This is something I've specialized in. I have about a 95% conversion rate. That is to say that folks that reach out to me, 95%, 95 out of 100 work with me. And that's because I do a lot of work to make sure that my website is my, if you will, dating profile. So whenever I'm coming up to a seasonal review, I'm going back to my website and saying, does this accurately represent who I am out to the world? And I'm totally open to changing it. A lot of people think the website, once it's up, it's in stone. Couldn't be further from the truth. We have an opportunity to continually grow in this business, and our businesses should grow. And so how we showcase, how we hang the shingle to tell everybody else what we do grows with us. And in that, we start to get a better sense of who we are, which, as Masanobu Fukuoka said, agriculture is the perfection of the human being, not the cultivation of the land. And so too is finding your gifts and offering them meaningfully to others. It's the cultivation of ourselves. It's the perfection of ourselves. And through each epoch of our lives, we're going to change and grow. And so our businesses should do so with us. And finally, how do you build smooth administration and sales systems? So this is a really important one. A lot of folks get excited about permaculture, get excited about offering a business, and don't think about the tripod, the 3 stools. One is reputation building. You have to be building reputation. If you're not talking about what you're doing, talking about your point of view, showcasing design, showcasing installation, no one ever gets a chance to know what it is you do. The second is admin, sales, systems. What's the back end? How does the work flow and allow you to do the work that you do? And some people hire that out. A good colleague and friend of mine, Zach Weiss, has an office manager because he's so busy. He's going from job to job. So he has somebody else to take care of that. And they themselves are a farmer, but they themselves are a stationary farmer. So they've got 2 to 3 hours a day where they dedicate office time. It works out great. And then find that last leg is the craftsperson. That's the craftsmanship. That's the what we're doing and how we're doing it. Now, most of us get excited about that. We don't focus on the other 2 legs. That's called a monopod, and those fall over. So it's really about understanding that we have these 3 legs and we have to work upon them. And then as you get down, there's a couple of opportunities to take a look and to show the different types of processes. So if you are interested in that, definitely take a look at there. We've got that pre-launch list as well. So those are my announcements. And I'm going to answer Wesley's first question while he's typing his second. So his first question is, I noticed there aren't any tutorials on assignment 19. Could you possibly share some experiences? Happily. So a couple things about assignment 19, zone 1 design. So zone 1 is the area immediately around or where human initiative begins. That's zone 0. Zone 1 is where you mainly traffic into and out of a site, or it's where you live on a site, or it's where the tool shed is or the warehouse is. It's where the cars come to and people disembark if you're working in on group projects, or if you're working on community farms, or if you're working on a CSA that's doesn't have a live-in residence. This is really about being in that center space, wherever that might be on your site. So the first map we work on is zone 1. So we have your whole base map here, and then we have zone 1 highlighted. And then from there, we get into what are the existing conditions. So there's a couple of areas you're going to be focusing on. focus on those areas, showcase those areas, tell us where those areas are. Similarly, we're going to take a look. You're going to show us a couple of those view corridors. Now, again, a couple folks have picked this up from previous assignments. Your view corridor, you can color this and then color the boundary of your image. And that's a really great way to showcase where you are and what we're taking a look at. Just going to mute everybody here. There we go. Now, we get into existing conditions, zones, and microclimates. So really, this is an opportunity to showcase a little bit more of the different areas. So what are the existing conditions? What do they look like? What are some of the zones, the microclimates? What are some of the pre-existing cross-sections if your existing cross-section was through this area, or if you're creating something that could benefit from cross-section, and generally for putting in vegetation, it can always benefit. So we put that in. And then what's the main goal? So what are we focusing on? We've seen this pattern before. This is a strategies and patterns example. We saw this in our plant design. So again, we're getting a sense of what's the main goal, what are the strategies and patterns, putting those patterns directly onto that base map, really showcasing what it is that we're trying to work upon. Finally, water strategies. Not finally, but next is water strategies. So water is really about the passive and the active, the passive and the active. And I will be a bit more stringent about this. We're into the final stages of the workshop. So pardon me, the course. So if you don't show me where your passive and your active rainwater harvesting strategies overflow, marks will be taken away. And that'll mean you'll have to go back in and revise it and do it again. So basically, whenever we have areas that have further design elements that have water, you have to show me the overflow. If you have a rain barrel, you have to show the overflow. If you have a swale, you have to show the overflow. If you have a pond, you have to show the overflow. When you look at the total accumulation of water capacity of a site, as we did back in assignment 5 or week 5, you know how much a site can absorb or has the ability to capture. It's just a drop in the bucket. That 1,000-liter tote, drop in the bucket. Even your pond, even if it's a megaliter of water it holds, it's still a drop in the bucket. Next, we're going to do a Zone 1 design proposed plan. So this is getting back into the vegetation strategy, as we've seen before, really showcasing different areas. And I remember when Lauren first sent this in, this was a revision. Lauren had a pathway that went perfectly downhill. Well, if you have a pathway, a break, and I think these were Hugels, Hugelkulturs. If you have a single pathway that's directly downslope, that's going to create channelization, that's going to create erosion. So we had her offset these Hugelkultur connects, so that way it went cross slope. So just again, think about maintenance, think about access, think about all those elements that come into it, because we have to be conscientious about it. Again, we're into a vertical title bar, but again, if the work that you've been doing is horizontal, feel free to put in the horizontal and just move things around. So additional design elements, and especially as we get into Zone 1, you may be working with specific types of plant propagation, like espalier, working on either fences or trellises or things of that nature. You may be working with arches. You may be working with Hugelkultur. So this is a great way just to showcase, again, any image that comes off the internet, you have to provide the full URL and the access date. And you can have multiple slides like this if you have additional elements. Now, Zone 1 for many of us can be a great opportunity to increase or decrease the energy consumption. So sometimes in these elements, we're taking a look at increasing the insulative value of our walls or our ceilings. We're taking a look at additional elements, be they cooking elements or recreational elements. So do keep that in mind, that as we get into this design work, it's not just about the vegetation. In many ways, it's about the design elements. So for example, on my house, for the last couple of years, last year we had locust and they wiped out close to 80% of the garden and the food. So all of my favas died out. But this year, I strung lines up and down my beds that I created, and the house, and I'm having favas climb up the strings, the trellises, to the fascia boards of the house, so that way they can shade out the house, and we're finding that it's actually starting to, it's helping. So there might be other elements for energy systems. This may be where your solar cookers or your solar dehydrators or your cob ovens go. This may be where your greenhouses go. It's great conversation to pull in the elements. Do you have to do it in this format? No. As usual, we're just looking for this information, and you can put it in where you can. Now, some of you got this and some of you didn't. When we talked about this back in the plant design assignment, this SWOT analysis is of your design. So you are talking about the strengths of your design. You're talking about the weaknesses of your design. You're talking about the opportunities and the threats. So what are some of the things within your design that aren't perfect? And guaranteed there'll be some. No design survives first implementation, no plan. And this is a great opportunity to really talk about, potentially your experience, potentially the fact that you've never done this before, and there's going to be different elements that we have to think about and work with. So keep that in mind as you work throughout this. So now I'm going to go back to 18, but I'm going to take a pause for any questions around that first assignment, Zone 1 design. Any questions about that?
I just have a quick question. There are a lot of slides in here. So that last design element slide, I noticed in the example, it's the same example on several different slides. So if we could fit all of those elements on one design, do we still need to have those additional slides?
Nope. Great question, Shara. We do not need all of the slides. What we do need is all the information that the slides are requesting. So you do need to show the vegetation, the water, access, maintenance. If you are doing any energy focused design elements, you need to showcase that. And you need to, as usual, showcase what is pre-existing as grayscale and what is new in color to really showcase that. And I'll hit on water again. A lot of people like to say that they will hand water. If anybody who's hand watered even a dozen trees for 1 year, you'll know that hand watering can be problematic. You know that anything left to human error will eventually fail. So just consider what your ideal situation might be and what your backup might be. So ideally, you might say, yeah, I really want to create some tree guards and some tree cages. I want to make sure that I have irrigation and spaghetti string around each one of these, doing pressure compensated line. But that'll be dependent on budget. And I think what we'll have to do for year one is do hand watering. And that's okay. Just start to think in a phasing concept where that might go. And then if you don't have passive watering integrated, I highly recommend it. And so on urban scales, this can look like swale trails. These are pathways where they're swales, but they're filled with wood chips. Sometimes we can take the downspouts of different buildings, be they houses or structures or buildings or lean-tos or carports, and we can run that directly into that swale trail with perforated big O pipe, or sometimes called weeping tile or drainage tile. We can bring that water directly into that area and start to have it infiltrate. So on urban scales, really think about rainwater harvesting. On rural scales, even more so. How are we going to capture this water? How is it going to come into the landscape? What are we going to use to hold that water in the landscape? So what does water holding capacity increase of soil look like? Is that aerated compost extracts and teas? Is that mob stock grazing, working with animals in a concerted way to have them collectively on an area? So that way we can start to increase the amount of carbon of our soils and organic matter, which will inevitably increase the water holding capacity of the WHC. So building on that, consider all of those pieces. How are we going to lead this site in the most self-supporting way? And that's where a lot of the mentality comes. And if you're at a point in your design process where you'd like to go back to hand drawing, or you'd like to move over to digital, feel free to. This is a course. This is where experimentation happens. This is the workshop. This is the laboratory. So really work to explore more of who you are as a designer as we get into these design elements. Any other questions about this assignment? Okay. Building survey is pretty straightforward. Folks tend to make a few mistakes here. So one of the things we're trying to get a sense of is what were the local materials that were used by the indigenous people. And sometimes when you're into places like Europe and otherwise, you may be still part of that indigenous nature. There might have been epochs of indigenous individuals who were on that land, or historic individuals who were on that land. And what a lot of people kind of miss is they go, well, longhouses aren't going to make good sense in this climate, or we can't really do longhouses anymore because building codes don't work with it. It's not exactly what we're driving at here. How did these individuals live in this landscape that our design sites at for millennia? Well, one of the main takeaways we should be getting at is they worked with the materials they had, using them in such a way that when they were finished or used up or rotten, they went back into the land. They were decomposed. They were brought back in terms of soil or in terms of material. So while we might get kind of excited about some of these different indigenous processes, and it's fine to get excited, just really take the moment to think about, okay, why were they created that way? What were some of the concepts or the lessons or the conversations? The Yurok First Nation that I've had some time to connect with down in northwestern California, some of their building structures are just ingenious because of the way that they're cantilevered. Okay, great. Well, that's a concept. I'm not necessarily going to be taking redwoods out of a place that they grow all the way to a place where they don't. But some of those concepts, those conversations we can take in. Same thing with SWOT. So we're taking a look, what are the strengths of that? What are the weaknesses? And this is where some of the weaknesses come out. Okay, well, I can't exactly build one and potentially live in it full time, but there's lots of opportunities to learn from this, to grow from this. Threats, I think in general, are basically we're losing quite a bit of that deep traditional knowledge and education. And without an honoring of it and without a opportunity to allow it to be reinvigorated, we may lose it forever. And this was very true about so much of prescription fire lighting, which I did a deep dive into when I created the Facing Fire documentary. Questions about the building survey?
I do have a question. So you were just mentioning epochs, and that's very true about the area I'm in, which is Hungary. So traditionally, the first settlers, they were traveling nomads and they used yurts. Obviously, that died out around 1,000 years ago. So the question to me is, and then like most locals went over to building with clay, which is also the house that I inherited when I bought that site. It's an adobe house. So my question is, which epoch should I honor here? Should I honor both? Should I mention the yurts and be like, okay, this is not what I am about because there's already an adobe house? Or should I then rather deep dive into the adobe building that's over 100 years old and has centuries of history in the country as well? Like, should I kind of mention all epochs, or should I rather deep dive on the one that I consider relevant for my design side?
Yeah, great question. I'll definitely leave that up to you. The German part of me wants you to do every single epoch and have footnotes for days. And then there's the relative nature of it, which is, here's an epoch that I think is relevant to me, and here's why I think so. So I would say, showcase the examples that you think are relevant and go from there. We only have so much time before the end of the course, so we don't need to go into a big long conversation about it.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I did want to show one example of a Zone 1 design that was recently done that has yet to be updated to the template. So this is, you'll have seen some of Adria's work earlier in the template. And she just did such an excellent job that I want to take a moment and go through it. So first and foremost, she took her pre-existing base map in grayscale and showcased what that zone 1 was. So great detail, call out, pulled it out, really easy to understand what the area is. Then she did a couple of images color coded so we could get a sense of where all the different areas were. Gave us a sense of the existing conditions, the zones, cross section as well. And did an excellent job of showing the different patterns. So we want some outdoor seating here, outdoor seating, edible, wind and smoke break, evergreen privacy screen, outdoor seating area, outdoor seating lounging. This is also a great place if you wanted to bring in some of your sectors as they as they made sense. And this is ostensibly what we're doing in some of the privacy screening. So you could make that more specific if you wanted to. So we have 2 pieces here. We've got that first goal and the second goal. So goal 1, goal 2. Goal 2, value the margins, lots of valuing the margins, direct roof runoff, value the margins, shade gardening. So a couple more examples. Goal 3, improve security. So further flow access, block unwanted access, improve flow. Because Adria had a number of folks that lived on site as well. So wanted to make sure there was better flow. Now we get into some of those water strategies. So can we get some easy hose access in here? Trail system, little inspirational image, contour farming for passive irrigation, irrigation from downspout to herb garden, beds from runoff, starting to showcase that. Then we get into the proposed design. So we're showcasing where are the pathways, what are some of the hardscapes, outdoor living spaces, outdoor areas, some specific plants already. And then we get into a detailed planting plan. So what's the canopy, sub-canopy, shrubs, and ground covers? This is a brilliant way to showcase what are these different layers. And then again, just using Google Slides, showcasing all these different areas and what they are and what they're going to be created into. A little bit of a narrative. We're using bolded highlighting. So oak, hickory, hackberry, sweet gum overstory is not a closed canopy, using dappled sunlight in southwest woods. Shade tolerant plus juglone tolerant perennials, edible native guide to begin along the trail at the west perimeter of the farmhouse and continue downslope to the west southwest property boundary. Passive water management strategy, trail swales on contour to slow and sink water runoff, slowly replace non-native invasives with desired planting using the NAP method. NAP again is Stefan Stobanowski's Miracle Farm approach of doing a nitrogen fixer, apple, plum, pear, nitrogen fixer, apple, plum, pear. Now the apple plum could be anything. It's just nitrogen fixer, key species, nitrogen fixer. So that way you always have a nitrogen fixer for every single plant within the planting guide. Now, in many ways, there was a lot of different access materials that she just put a slide because there wasn't the ability to put it on the slide. So she put it on that final slide, which was great. And really showcase, most of the area directly surrounding the farmhouse are shaded with limited solar access, solar power, and greenhouse. Solar dehydrated or impractical. Old and awkward fencing provides some security, but limit access and flow. Really, really excellent way of going into a SWOT analysis. So this was a great example and really showcased a thoughtful way of showcasing what was happening and what was going to be designed into the site. A couple of pieces of feedback that I gave her, especially as into the proposed plan, I would have liked to see more of the water flow on this to understand what this looked like. And one thing that was missing here was a cross section. So really showcasing what that cross section would look like and detailing out how those swales would work. Because one of the things we didn't see here is overflow. So how did these actually overflow one into the other? Any questions about that example? Just going to check out chat. Chat's empty. Okay. So going back to our questions, wonder if you had to deal with Japanese beetles. They're wild. I haven't, Leslie. But I do have a couple of friends who have dealt with them. So I'm gonna make a note here for me, just a reminder to reach out to colleagues.
It could just be one of those years, right? But I've never really seen them in this part of the province. The first time I ever saw them was a bit further east, and so just dealing with them this year, and they're making their way through everything. They're grazers. They like everything that I like, apparently.
Yep. They are indeed. They are indeed. I've never dealt with them, so I don't have any personal experience to speak to.
That's all good. Yeah, there's lots of theories out there. Just thought it'd be interesting to hear if you could have any of your own, or can find some elsewhere.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it and see what I come up with.
Cool. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
Great summary of number 19, assignment 19 there too. Thanks for that.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks. Appreciate it. Christopher Javin, in your previous feedback in the plant design, you mentioned that you would recommend Hugelkultur for establishing Salix in dry climates. Any pointers on how to go about it? Would you sink the Hugelkultur underground and then plant the willows into it, or would you do traditional and plant the Salix onto mound? Okay, so a couple of points to start off with. So let's start with Hugelkultur. So Hugelkultur is a way of creating a trench, and was popularized by Sepp Holzer. Sepp's Hugelkulturs were usually 1.5 meters to 2 meters wide in terms of their trench and deep. And then we would put decomposing wood into that trench ideally. Fresh cut wood will have fungicides in the bark, and so it can take a longer time to decompose. And generally, we want to put anything in the trench that is already decomposing. This will ensure that even some of the volatile woods, things like juniper, robinia, once they're starting to be colonized and decomposed, they're fine to go into the ground. Things we want to avoid putting into Hugelkultur: anything fresh cut that has volatile oils, or anything fresh cut that can regrow from cuttings. Things like Salix, things like alder, things like redwoods or dogwood. Other things we want to be conscientious about is that when we put that wood in, we want to then put our soil back in from the trench almost immediately. And usually when we want to mulch it. So Sepp would mulch with boughs, conifer boughs, sometimes straw, sometimes wood chips. There's a lot of different elements that he would put into his specific types of hugels. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that Hugelkultur doesn't magically bring water to it. You have to have it placed in such a way so that way water is directed to the Hugelkultur, or it can pick up overland flow. So just making a Hugelkultur doesn't mean it's going to have water around it, and it doesn't mean it's actively going to hold water. Over time, it'll decompose, increase the watering holding capacity, and it'll be some of the best soil on the landscape. But unless it's being fed water, that's not going to be the case. So I think, Christopher, the intent of what I was saying is that if you were trying to establish Salix, I would use Hugelkultur as an experiment, because Salix is water loving, and if you were trying to establish it, I would find a shaded, wet spot already on site, and then augment that with Hugelkultur if possible, and either have any roof structures drain to it or through it. So this is something we've done before, where we take a perforated big O pipe or perforated pipe, or sometimes just have the water flow to it. We did this in a rather big key dam, and basically the key dam was in such a way that when the water came in, there was a Hugelkultur on the backside. And so when the water drained into the dam, it wicked up the Hugelkultur. And actually, I should be able to find photos of that if we're interested in looking at it. So the second thing to understand is Hugelkultur will lose up to 40% of its height, or in just general volume over time. It'll decompose. So this is one of the reasons why we do not plant into the mound. We can plant vegetables into the mound. We can plant shrubs on the edge of the mound. We can plant trees on the edge of the mound. But the mound itself, we don't plant trees into, because trees need solid perches. So even if it's Salix, we're not going to plant the Salix directly into the mound. We probably put it on one side or the other, depending on what was the wetter side. And what that might look like is, if you're on an incline and we've got our mound, this is probably going to be the wet side. That would be the place where I'd want to be planting that or planting that Salix. So I'll draw that out for folks so we get a good sense of what I'm talking about. So if this is ground, maybe we decide that if we're taking a look at how this land looks in cross section, This is kind of an inflection point. It's kind of steep and then flat. And here's another little tiny inflection point. So if I had to choose, and this was the site I was given, I would say probably here I would look at in a dry climate. So we'd build our trench, put in our wood. Wood would come up a little bit, put in our soil, mulch or armor it. And then depending on what the species was and the plants were, I think in your climate, Christopher, if I was doing this and this was the site I was given, I'd probably put Salix here. And again, Salix can grow from live cutting, so it's easy enough to cut and then plant during whatever your rainy season is. And that's probably what I do. One of the things that we've been very conscientious of is that hugelkulturs and swales are not compatible. The reason for this is that we want the hugelkultur to be a terrestrial environment. That is to say, we want it still to have interstitial airspace. So if we go into a macro view and we take a look at soil under a microscope, you're going to see all these soil PEDs. These are sand, silt, and clay and organic matter that's visible. Now, when we have interstitial airspace, it means that we still have the ability to have a water lens around all of these different soil PEDs. Soil PEDs, again, are made of sand, silt, and clay and organic matter, not to mention all the different microorganisms in it. But you can see, you know, if this is at a 10,000x magnification, there's still air in between these different areas. So we still have air here, which if we are in soil, we need, because all of our microbiology needs air as well. The problem when you make a hugelkultur also a swale, so that would be that this might be directly on contour, is that it's going to create a aquatic environment. And what'll happen is eventually this entire area is going to be filled up with water. And now we're no longer into a terrestrial environment. And what happens? All of the microbiology drowns. And again, that microbiology is what creates the nutrition for the plants. So this is why we don't have hugelkulturs and swales go hand in hand. Usually with hugels, we'll be slightly off contour or we'll be on a flat slope. Basically, they're there to create a repository for microorganisms, a repository for water, and eventually have it so that way these trees can have their root system find into this water and be self-established. And this happened in a project I was working on. I'm just going to pull up All Points. Allpointsdesign.ca is my website, and under the portfolio, actually I can share this as I'm doing it just to showcase. So we have topographical. This was actually the hugelkultur I was talking about. I'll bring that up. Farm scale Hugel pilot project. Here we are. So this was on Galiano Island for the Galiano Conservancy Association. And I think, yeah, there we go. So we had our hugelkulturs here, and our hugelkulturs had also bed mounds. This is back when I was still using Google SketchUp for my design work. Now, what ended up happening here is that the mounds, it's a good photo of the mounds. The mounds ended up not being watered. So these planting mounds on the lower side weren't watered. Everything in the planting mounds died in year one, but all of the trees were still alive. And there's this great video that they put together in 2020 just to showcase how long it's come along, or how far it's come along, pardon me. So that's a good one to take a look at. And then the hugelkultur in the pond. This is working with something called a Kaiser spider, probably one of the most interesting excavators. It can go up straight walls and does quite an amazing process. And there are a couple of good videos. But what I wanted to showcase here, there we go. So basically, this was the pond that was being created, and the drainage came in like so. So the water came in like this. And it was built in such a way so that way when it filled up, the water would actually drain out the backside as well. So the key way was here, the dam wall was here, and we had all these trees we took out. And so I said, well, let's make a Hugelkultur. So we're actually standing on this, I think 20 by 25 foot wide Hugelkultur. You can take a look at us. Gord's a solid 6 feet, so it was like good 12 to 18 feet tall. And this became this little nut nursery here that anything they put on would grow, because what would happen is as the water came in, this water would suck up all of these logs that were put on, and these were freshly cut. So not normally what we do, but we had them, so we used them and built it up. And now it's just gorgeous. I still have to go back. They ended up selling the property, so you'll find this as you do this type of work. Sometimes going back to previous projects is difficult because the people are no longer the same. So I think for you, Christopher, what I would do is I would find the wettest spot on the land. I would try and direct water to it. And then depending on how that wet spot is, I would put the Salix on one side, on the side that was the wetter area. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I have one follow-up question to
Please.
that. So you said that soils don't go well with Hugelkultur, given that if they're also on contour, they just basically become anaerobic. Could I, or the idea that I had is for the orchard area, I have the roof and I would just run the downspout into small swales along the trees, because you have around 600 millimeters of rain a year, and around half of that actually comes in the hottest summer months when it's the most arid. So I could just drastically increase the water to the fruit trees. The question would be, is there any argument against running the swales perpendicular to the Hugelkultur, so that the Hugelkultur would be at the very end and the swale would kind of terminate there, so any excess overflow would go into the Hugelkultur to moisten that up?
Oh, that's a good idea. Let me think about that for a second. Yeah, I think my only concern might be is normally when we're doing rows of swales, we have an overflow, a level sill spillway, which is perfectly dead level. And that usually overflows onto the next swale. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to interrupt that cycle. So let's say you had 3 swales and you had an overflow that came to one and an overflow that came to one. Maybe at that final one, I may allow that overflow to move to a Hugel to make sure that, we've captured every single drop of the rainwater. But what I worry is that, if you have a sponge and you have a straw full of water and you have, 3 straws of water that are, like little gutters that are open, and all the water goes into this one and it heads into the sponge, 2 and 3 aren't going to get any of the overflow from one. They're just going to get the roof, the water area capture above it. And if that's 5 or 10 meters, it's not a lot. So yeah, I worry about that.
Maybe if I specify, because I didn't give some base criteria, maybe I shouldn't use the word swales, because swales would traditionally be on contour. Now the orchard area is very flat and I don't have much elevation, so I wouldn't do swales on contour. Rather, I would do something like soakage ditches, or I'll come up with a sexier
Like
term for it. Just
Hugels around each tree?
Basically the trees are in perfect row, and just between the rows I would have small ditches that are level, where the water overflow from the roofs can go and then can just seep in for the trees. But they wouldn't be on contour, because mapping out the contour on such a small scale, like such a small orchard, also with barely any incline, I don't think that would be worth the effort. So the swales would run parallel to each other, and then there would be 3 swales or soakage ditches, however I would call them, and all 3 could terminate in the Hugelkultur, and then have maybe a security overflow if it gets really too much water for the Hugelkultur to divert it to a small pond or something like that.
Yeah,
The idea,
Go ahead.
so just because like why I'm thinking about this is because the weather conditions are very peculiar. It's a lot of rain, very quick in the summer, and then the same day it goes up to 30, 40 degrees Celsius again. So it becomes arid the same day that it's like 1 hour or 2 hours of intense rain sometimes, and then it becomes arid again. So that's why I'm thinking whether with this climate, I would avoid kind of overwatering the Hugelkultur, using that as an overflow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, depending on the sizing of the orchard and its maturity, what I might do is I might dig in small Hugels, small pathways, fill them with material, just to create little reservoirs of potential water holding capacity. If now that I'm hearing a little bit more about your climate, I might do something like that, because similar to the project I was just showing you, at least then you've got something that's in between each of these orchard rows. And I think that would then mitigate having to put something at the end. And I don't really think that you're going to get much value out of something at the end. Whereas if it is what we think it is, if we've got all our trees here, and if we have, basically pathways that we're filling in with mulch or material, or doing full Hugels and then just having them a little proud, so that way, basically when they decompose, they're going to be flat. So it'll be, you've taken a pathway and you're basically creating a water holding capacity storage in it that over time will increase its water holding capacity. And maybe that first one, that's what you do. Maybe when you dig them, you put in big O pipe, and then you have an output at the top, and you have a splitter. So that way, as the rain comes off the roof or some other material, then you can split it into those 3 or 2. But I think that's probably what I would do if that's the water pattern I was presented with.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're most welcome. We have a final question here from Shara. Do you have any ideas for incorporating edible mushrooms, fungi into a semi-arid climate with very dry seasons? Yeah, so we've done this a few times. And so first and foremost, you're going to have to find the place that already has pre-established shade. So mushrooms definitely are partial to dappled shade or heavy shade. There are some sun-loving mushrooms. They tend not to be as delicious as the other mushrooms. So that could be more on an edible, or pardon me, on a medicinal aspect. But in terms of culinary gourmet mushrooms, my go-to, especially in urban situations, is to do swale trail pathways with usually Ramil wood chips, alder wood chips, and then integrate in mycelium. So integrate in the Western garden giant, Stropharia rusula annulata. I think that's the one. Only because it works in almost all climates. It works in zone 2 in Canada. So if it works in zone 2, it'll work in Utah. And the reason why I put them into those swale trails, and sometimes that's where the downspout comes from the roof, is that it will arguably get more and more and more increase its ability to have water holding capacity. And in doing so, it will increase the potential aspects necessary for that mushroom to colonize. The other reason I like doing it that way is if you colonize your pathways, you're now cropping your pathways. So not only are you cropping your beds, but you're cropping your pathways. Years ago, I had somebody say, well, what do you do when the mushrooms pop out? You pick them? Like, I don't know. So that could be a really useful way of doing it. If you are going to make a mushroom bed, make sure it's in a place that's wetter than the rest of the area. Make sure it's in a dappled shade. Usually when we do mushrooms beds, we'll put down a layer of cardboard, or we'll put down a layer of newspaper, because we want to have a barrier. Sometimes we'll actually even dig it down. So we'll dig down like you're American, so a 5 foot by 10 foot area, and then dig down a half a foot, and then layer out, like layer down a layer of alder chips, freshly cut alder chips. This is now working in opposite of our Hugelkultur conversation. We're using something like alder. Most mushrooms will colonize alder very quickly. But if, that's the point, they'll colonize them quickly. So if you don't play God and say, hey, I want you to colonize this. The spore bank in the air and in the soil will colonize that for you. So you have to find that window, and it's basically cut and application. Now, there's a really interesting pseudo pasteurization method that Paul Stamets created, which is really quite ingenious. You basically take your alder chips and you soak them in water. So basically you put them into a vessel and you have some sort of weight that you can put on top. And so I think we had like expanded metal lath and a couple of like 5-10 pound plate weights that we put on top. So basically the alder chips were submerged in water. What does this do? Well, it takes a terrestrial element and puts it into an aquatic environment, and an anaerobic one without water or without oxygen. So what happens when it doesn't have oxygen? It gets that awesome smell. You'll love it. It'll be terrible. But at that point, you know that that material has moved out of a terrestrial colonization and into an aquatic. So after about 2 or 3 days after the smell starts, then what we do is we take a tarp and we throw the alder and water onto it. We allow the sun to solarize it, basically killing off any of the aquatics, and we have basically sterile medium. Now, for those of you that are sticklers for words, you'll know that sterility is like being pregnant. It's not one of those things that you can be sort of. So it's more akin to being pasteurized. It's kind of, it's pseudo pasteurized, but it's a great way to, without taking a lot of heat and energy and all the rest of it, to pasteurize or sterilize chips, doing it that way. So once we have our area, so either if it's above ground, we put on our cardboard or newspaper. If it's below ground, cardboard, newspaper. Then we put on anywhere from 2 to 4 inches of chips. Then we'll put on a 1/2 inch to a full inch of mycelium. So this is what's called bunker spawn. We'll usually buy this from a local cultivator, and they'll usually cultivate either on alder chips, wood chips, or they'll cultivate on grain spawn. We spread that out. We do another 2 to 4 inches, and we can sandwich that. We can do 2 or 3 or 4 layers. Usually I will just do 2 to 4 inches, an inch of mycelium, 2 to 4 inches, an inch of mycelium, and then leave that top material. At that point, I'll usually put on a geowoven textile. So geowoven textile will allow water to come through, but it won't allow sun to penetrate quite deeply. So it's again, giving another shading quality. Back when I was scraping, in terms of finances, I would use lumber wrapper. So this is the wrapper that dimensional lumber comes in with at hardware stores, construction stores, black on one side, white on the other. And depending on the time of year, if I wanted more heat units, black would be up. If it was too hot, white would be up to reflect. But lumber wrapper was geowoven, so water could come through. These days, I'm using DeWalt Sunbelt material, which I use in all of my annual production, just to reduce the amount of weeding. And then basically you set it and forget it. You're going to leave it for upwards of a month or two. You're going to check it for water every once in a while, make sure it's watered. And usually within 3 to 6 months, you'll have colonization and you'll start to see mushrooms pop up. In wet climates where we've done this, we've created, I think the one bed produced something like 200 to 300 pounds of oyster mushrooms. It was insane, especially when you take a look at oyster mushrooms. At least the last time I checked, were 15 to 20 bucks a pound for organic. So pretty good return on investment. And bunker spawn is usually relatively cheap. You can get a bag, you can get a 5-pound bag for, 40 to 50 bucks. So those are the two methods I usually work in those areas. The other method, which is a lot more work, feels like you're doing more, but the results are variable upon the skill of the operator. So I would say the first one is low skill, medium to high results. And this next approach is medium to high skill, medium to low results. But, for those human doers of us, makes us feel like we're doing something. So this is basically when you're doing stump inoculation and log inoculation. So you're going through the whole process of either getting plug spawn or getting an injector. You're drilling out holes. You're making sure your holes are at the right depth for the plug spawn, putting in the plugs that are already myceliated, doing your beeswax or your latex, and having logs that are all completely myceliated out. You know, this is the reishi approach out of China and Japan. And you can do that. You just have to have quite a bit of water for them to colonize. And so a lot of those logs we would leave in wet areas, so that way the water could slowly absorb through bark, but not through the injury. So we would, you know, we'd latex the ends and latex all of the little points. And it was only because latex was cheap. You know, if I had the money at that point to work with beeswax and pitch and, you know, all of those things, I would, but it's just time and money. It always is. And then those plug spawns. So a colleague of mine, Peter McCoy, whose book is actually right behind me here, Radical Mycology, fantastic book. He introduced me to spawn injectors. So if you have bunker spawn, they're basically like a plunger, and so basically you put all the material into it, and then you plunge it into the open hole that you make on your log. And it's about a 20 to 30% saving in terms of the plugs. Plugs are more expensive almost always. So you can do that, but the problem is that the ground serves as such an insulating capacity. Plus, you can put tarps over it and all the rest of it with the bed process or with the pathway process, that you're not as worried about water. You don't have to maintain it as much. Whereas with the logs, you really do. You have to watch them. They dry out really easily. Colonization can stop really easily. User error when you're using those drills. Like one of the things we found quite a bit is that if that plug depth, I'll do it this way. If that plug depth isn't the same as the drill depth, so if the drill depth is deeper than the plug depth and there's an air gap in the hole, that can basically stall colonization completely. And you know, truthfully, I don't know the science behind it. I just know that was an effect of what was happening. So yeah, I would say those are kind of the three ways that I typically bring mushrooms into an area. The other ways I'll do it is I will bring in down and duff. So I'll bring in the myceliated forest soil of the local environment, and I will inoculate certain areas of the garden. So I'll bring in like this much, you know, like a good amount, keep it together and incorporate it into the soil, again, usually into a forested area or a shrub area, keeping with that fungal approach. Because once you're into your perennials, your woody deciduous, your woody conifers, that soil will be fungally dominated. Whereas if you put that fungal insert into disturbed soil that is mostly bacterially dominated, it's going to have a harder time. So I tend to put it in those areas. And have done so for a long time, actually. The more I got into this work, probably in year 5 or 6, I noticed if I brought indigenous microorganisms from the local flora and fauna into the garden, the better the garden did, as well as food production. So if we were doing full production, the better it did as well. So both of those were real advantageous approaches that continue to help the garden grow and flourish. Yeah. Did I answer the question? Was there more or less you were looking for?
Yeah, that's all great information.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, folks, we're coming into the last 21 days of the course. So really think about time management. Think about where you want to put your time into these last 4 assignments. If you feel like you are going a little bit batty with the zone 1 design and you want to put more into the final design, you know, feel free to. You know what's required. So if you just put in what's required, and you know, even if you want to send me a note being like, hey, wasn't my best work, but I'm giving more of my time to my final design, it's totally fine. I totally get it. Just make sure that if you are struggling or having any problems, you reach out. Happy to spend time with anybody if you need it. And yeah, I think that's about it. Generally, how's it going with everybody? How's the final few weeks of the course feeling?
I think it's really fun, but it is a lot of work.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Shara, because I I went back and forth on this for a long time because my PDC was, hey, here's the concepts, good luck. And it was very, it was very hard to get established and processed and all the rest of it. And so I know from the students that have come out of the pro course, because I think we're on session 4 or 5 of the pro, they've been able to go into design within weeks, some of them, which is amazing. That's a lot of self-starting nature. Not everybody is eligible for that, but they were able to go in really quickly because they had a lot more tools than I think I had and others had. So I completely hear you on the work, but hopefully that work's going to pay off in terms of site analysis, assessment, design, process, ability. So yeah, totally hear you. And I just want to shout out to the first couple of pro students that did this week by week, because I think the amount of work that we have here on a week by week schedule is pretty challenging. So Victor, you put up your hand, sir. What would you like to ask?
Yes, thank you, Javan. I hear you have a cold. I wish you well. Recover quickly. Yeah. I've been having some serious connectivity issues. I'm sure you've seen I've not submitted my previous assignments, but I promise I've done them. It's just a matter of them being uploaded. So I'm having a struggle with that. I also have some questions that I thought I had uploaded. It turns out they did not synchronize to the Google Sheets. So I see they didn't show up on your questions list for this week. So if you will, please, may I ask them here now?
Sure. We're at 11. So I'm happy to take maybe 1 or 2 questions, and depending on timing, because I do have to get on with something at 11:30. So I've got probably 15 minutes that I can answer.
All right. Well, then I'll just limit them to 2 then. The first question is, I'm having a struggle around when it comes to the design. So I'm having a struggle around identifying or calculating how much food or how much vegetables and fruits to plant in order to feed a particular size of a family. So maybe if you have some kind of a solution to help me calculate that, that will be very helpful to say, okay, we're going to be producing this much food per annum. You should be able to feed maybe a family of 5 for a year. So I don't know exactly how to identify that. So I'm having a bit of a struggle with that. And then secondly, just to take us a couple of lessons back, I'm trying to figure out how can we get rid of snakes in a field without necessarily destroying them, and what's the best way of managing what's the best way of managing snakes, and what's the best way of managing moles in a site? Yeah, so those are my 2 questions really. Thank you.
So there's a lot there, yeah, we'll jump into that. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about food and food security. So colleague of mine, Kakasimu Squath, she's a Cree Métis woman north of Edmonton in Alberta. Her and I put together this family food security program, and the program is geared directly to answer that question. You know, how much food? Now it's based on a couple of assumptions. So this is a cheat sheet I made for a recent talk about food security and sovereignty, some of the major principles and motivations, what sovereignty is, what food security is, and how to build personal food security. I think what you'll be interested in is this list at the backside, which is generally the amount of plants necessary per person. So this is average food stores per person per year. So I'll put a link to this into the Q&A doc, and that should give you a good estimate in terms of how many of each you'll be looking for each person. So I'm just going to stop that share. I'm going to grab the link. And then I'm going to go back into our Q&A doc. So we've got Victor's questions, Victor's, and then so the first one was how much food per person? And we're going to put in this was called the food security cheat sheet. Awesome. And then the second question was how to manage snakes, and then how to manage voles, moles. Okay.
Yeah, I think the reading of the snakes altogether.
Come again, sorry?
I was saying, I think we'd prefer getting rid of the snakes altogether. But some of the snakes are quite huge. We should have a python on the site. I mean, oof, man.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very full and complicated conversation. I know in a couple of the places that we worked, we were dealing with snakes. So I'm going to share a couple of videos here. You can take a look at these at your leisure. These were really important to work with because one of the things when it comes to any snake, any pest, quote unquote, is working with integrated pest management. So what does integrated pest management mean? It means that there is a balance between predator and prey and habitat. So in any site, we will usually increase the habitat for the pests that we don't want to have in some way, shape, or form. And that would be my hypothesis, even for you, Wesley, going into the idea of, well, what's going on with Japanese beetles is, okay, what is the element that we have? And let's do a needs and yields take and inherent characteristics, this process we do in permaculture. So what does this animal need? What do they yield? And what are the inherent characteristics of the different breeds we're seeing, of the python, of the rattler, of the garter, all these different snakes? And then what is it in my site that is yielding more of what this element needs? So it gives us a sense, first and foremost, of assessing why do we have more of these quote unquote pests in our garden, in our fields, etc. So we do this first and foremost to understand the interconnectivity between this element and its ecology and us. And if we're ever going to not dissuade them. So we have an incredible array of gophers and ground squirrels at my site, to the point to where when you're watching the garlic dance back and forth, you know the bulb is gone. Or if you're watching the mulberry tree dancing back and forth and you go to pick it up and it's totally been chewed off at the bottom, it's always going to be something I have to deal with at the site. There's always going to be moles and voles. We've done everything under the sun, from trapping them with black holes. These are these traps that you put into runs and you capture them and bring them out. We've worked on, we've worked on any number of processes, but ultimately this is a site where I cannot introduce predation to these moles and voles. It's not possible. So it also means I have to start to think about how I'm going to design around them. And so part of it is working dogs. So we are introducing a couple of working dogs into the site, and it's been pretty successful. A number of the dogs have been helping to take care of the gophers and the ground squirrels when they pop up. Our trapping efforts are helping a bit. And generally we're doing some drowning out of their holes. So we're doing some pretty large water influxes that have been moderately helpful. In terms of snakes, the one operation that we had more help with is when we started to make more purchase for birds, for raptors. So we would create long, tall snags or posts that birds could have roost on, and they could have a place, a vantage point to then hunt. This helped really well in the Kenyan project, where we were able to introduce more birds and just have more open fields and understudy. or pardon me, overstory. And then the other was starting to recognize that the larger predators, some of the badgers and other elements there, were able to be invited in again by giving them habitat as well. So those have been my approaches, is just increasing predation, being conscientious of what I'm building and how I'm building it. And then those two videos should be helpful, Victor, taking a look at some more examples. And the one from India is quite good in terms of how they've been dealing with stinks.
All right. Thank you, Gavin.
You're welcome. And please do take the time now, if you want, to put in your future questions under the August 15th section. So that way you know that they're there. All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for your time. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Again, if you have any questions or comments, you need to reach out directly, please do. javin@allpointsdesign.ca. We can have a quick chat and even jump on Zoom if we need to sort anything out. I hope you enjoy the rest of the course, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care, everybody. Oh, you're welcome. Cheers. Bye now.
Thanks, Javin. Take
Welcome.
care.